I recently came across an old video by the great content creator known as Marcomannic, who made a video a while back analyzing the question of when exactly things started going wrong in the Roman Empire. A great video I recommend all of you to watch if you're interested. But in any case, watching that excellent video again reminded me and made me think about that first event, which, while we cannot say that it was entirely the cause of the beginning of Rome's decline, we can say that it was the first flame that spread throughout the empire, leaving consequences that, in the long term, would create circumstances and other contexts that would culminate in everything that led to the decline and eventual fall of the empire. And that event I'm referring to, of course, is the Antonine Plague. What began as a rebirth that should have been the almost natural continuation of multiple generations of competent emperors ended up being a crisis of greater scale than the empire had ever experienced before. Even if we like to romanticize that perfect timeline between Nerva and Marcus Aurelius being the absolute height of the Pax Romana, in reality, it's much more complicated than that. The Pax Romana was much more than just a completely peaceful and unhindered time. In fact, every emperor, except Antoninus Pius, had his own challenges to face, even in that period of unprecedented prosperity in all of ancient history. Of course, these challenges were contained on a much smaller scale, which did not interfere with the growth and prosperity of the empire as a whole, and that is why, despite this, it is still considered a time of unquestionable peace by the standards of that time. But Marcus Aurelius, as much as we like to imagine him as part of that period, there are sadly many examples of events that occurred during his reign that differ from that notion of Pax Romana. Don't get me wrong, Marcus Aurelius was a great and competent emperor, and his title as part of the line of the 5 good emperors is fully deserved, but considering him a good emperor is very different from claiming that he reigned during the period we now call the Pax Romana. And that is largely due, of course, to the catastrophic succession of bad fortunes he had to face during his reign, starting with what started it all, the Antonine Plague. Due to this plague, between 10 and 15% of the entire empire's population died in less than 2 decades. Very important people like Lucius Verus suffered from it. The empire's agricultural economy declined enormously due to a lack of manpower and the death of practically 2/3 of the Roman army. This, accompanied at the same time by Germanic wars and invasions that Marcus Aurelius had to deal with, forced the emperor to devalue the currency to recruit new, inexperienced soldiers, and even worse, Germanic mercenaries, in order to even continue to protect the empire's northern borders. This brought with it a series of unprecedented tragedies up to that point, such as the first cities sacked by the Germans on a scale that the Romans had never seen before, with the barbarians even almost managing to penetrate the Italian peninsula at some point, an event that would have been absolutely unthinkable for the Romans a few years earlier. And the only reason the consequences didn't seem as disastrous back then as they actually were was thanks to having an emperor of the caliber of Marcus Aurelius himself. But once he died, the consequences of the Antonine Plague would finally be felt throughout the empire, and even more so with the absence of new, competent emperors, leading to an unparalleled domino effect that would lead to all the future events we all know so well. And it is with that reflection in mind that I asked myself the following question. What if the Roman Empire was not affected by the Antonine Plague? That's the alternate scenario we'll look at today. And also, indirectly by thinking about that alternate scenario, it made me think of an idea to create an alternate scenario that has to do with Halloween. So stay tuned, because in a few weeks we'll return to that Antonine Plague event to explore a much crazier, absurd, but also horrifying alternate scenario. And without anything else to say, we can finally start with this current alternate scenario. So, in this timeline, after the returning soldiers from Lucius Verus's Parthian campaign, absolutely nothing would happen, only glory and prestige for having defeated the Parthians once again. Now, what would have been the immediate effects? First of all, the Roman Empire would have avoided the death of 10 to 15% of its entire population. We're talking about millions of people who would have lived, farmers to keep the fields productive, artisans to keep the cities vibrant, merchants to keep the trade routes alive. Rome would have preserved its full demographic strength, its villages filled instead of abandoned, its cities bustling instead of half-empty. The army, too, would have remained intact. Instead of seeing almost a third of its effectives vanish, Rome would have entered the 170s with its full force of nearly 500,000 soldiers, trained, disciplined, and most importantly, experienced. There would have been no need to recruit slaves, gladiators, and mercenaries to fill the ranks, and no dilution of that Roman military professionalism that had carried the empire to its greatest conquests, like sadly Marcus Aurelius was forced to do in our timeline. And talking about that, the economy would have remained far healthier. In reality, Marcus Aurelius was forced to debase the silver denarius, reducing its purity just to keep paying soldiers and hiring replacements, but in this timeline, the treasury would not have been drained by constant epidemics, recruitment shortages, and emergency campaigns. The currency would have remained stable, trade would have flowed smoothly and unchanged, and the empire's agricultural production would have avoided the dramatic decline caused by a lack of manpower in the fields. Even talking about the field of medicine, things would have changed. In our timeline, the plague killed countless physicians, some of the greatest medical minds of antiquity, due to having exposed themselves constantly to the sick. The result was a permanent loss of knowledge, a setback from which Roman medicine never fully recovered, but here, that generation of brilliant doctors survives. With Galen still active and his colleagues alive, medicine in the Roman world could have kept its heights and peak, and kept improving over time. With all of that, Rome during the 170s would not be weakened, but still at its peak like during Trajan and Hadrian's time. Population growing, economy flourishing, medicine still at its peak and still improving, and legions ready for anything. All of this sets the stage for what would come next, the Marcomannic Wars, with a very different outcome than the one we know. In our timeline, the Marcomannic Wars lasted almost 2 decades, with Marcus Aurelius having to fight year after year, campaign after campaign, all while the plague was devastating the empire behind his back. His armies were exhausted, under strength, and often filled with inexperienced recruits, being forced to fight endless battles just to keep the barbarians away from Italy, and even then, some Germanic tribes almost managed to penetrate the peninsula itself, an unthinkable humiliation for Rome. But here, things would be very different. Without the plague existing, Marcus Aurelius would command a full army of experienced veterans, trained, disciplined, and well-supplied. Instead of reacting desperately to invasions, Rome would take the initiative this time around. Campaigns would be planned, logistics would work, pay would be steady, and the soldiers would be confident in their emperor capabilities to lead them to glory. Without a plague, there would be no shortage of men and no fear of collapse in the rear. And thanks to all of that, by the middle of the 170s, the war would already be decided. The Marcomanni and the Quadi would be crushed, the Sarmatians forced into submission, and for the first time in centuries, the Romans would cross the Danube not just to push back the barbarians, but to stay for good this time. Marcus Aurelius's dream of creating 2 new provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia, finally would come true in this timeline. Roman fortresses would rise in the forest, and colonies of veterans would be established, with roads carved through the barbarian lands, tying them directly to the heart of the empire. And perhaps most importantly of all, with victory secure, the shadow of the Teutoburg forest would finally begin to fade. The humiliation suffered under Augustus almost 2 centuries earlier, when 3 entire legions were wiped out in Germania, could finally be avenged. More or less. Because after that, with the Danube frontier secure, the road into Germania would be once again wide open. That great victory by Marcus Aurelius would be a gigantic boost of morale for the Roman army and people, but the thing, as I said, would not change only the outcome of the Marcomannic Wars, it would also change the fate of Rome's succession. In our timeline, Marcus Aurelius, weakened by the plague and desperate to secure continuity, elevated his son Commodus very early. He was named Caesar in the 160s when he was only a child, and then co-emperor in the year 177 when he was just a teenager. It was a decision made out of fear, and out of necessity probably, one that I don't know, you guys, but I really hope he regretted, because if he didn't, I don't know what the hell was going on in his mind when he chose him as his successor. Because Marcus knew the empire was exhausted, its population decimated, and its armies dangerously reduced. In such a context, the only thing he could do was to make sure his dynasty would survive after him, no matter the cost. But in this timeline, with the plague never existing, none of that would be necessary. Rome would not be collapsing, the armies would not be starving for recruits, the treasury would not be drained, and Marcus would not feel forced to gamble everything on a boy completely unprepared for power. Instead, Commodus would never be made Caesar and never become co-emperor. He would remain what he always wanted to be, a prince of luxury, devoted to games, pleasures, and gladiatorial fantasies, cheered by the plebs for his spectacles, but with no role in government, no responsibility, and no danger to the empire. Meanwhile, with Commodus sidelined, Marcus Aurelius would be free to place his trust where it truly belonged, in his adoptive brother and co-emperor, Lucius Verus, who in this alternate timeline would still be alive. And it would be Verus, not Commodus, who would carry the entire empire after Marcus's death, ensuring that the destiny of the empire would remain in capable hands, even if in less stoic hands than Marcus's ones, of course. So, with Marcus Aurelius gone by the year 180, Lucius Verus, who in our timeline had died young of the plague back in 169, would still be alive in this alternate reality, now in his 50s, and ready to rule as sole emperor. Now, let's be honest, Lucius Verus was not Marcus Aurelius. He didn't have his brother's stoic discipline, nor his philosophical depth. In fact, many sources describe him as a man of pleasures, fond of luxuries, and not always the hardest worker. But still, he was no fool either, and he had already proven during his reign as co-emperor that he could rely on competent generals and administrators to win wars and govern effectively. The Parthian campaign, while not led by him directly, had been a success under his command, and he enjoyed real popularity with the soldiers. In this timeline, Verus would inherit an empire that was strong, wealthy, and secure thanks to the victories of Marcus. The new provinces of Marcomannia and Sarmatia would already be annexed, and the legions would be confident and loyal. All Verus would need to do was to continue the work his adoptive older brother had started, consolidating the Danube frontier, integrating the new provinces, and slowly preparing for what many believed was the ultimate goal for the Romans and their glory, Germania itself. With him at the helm, the empire would remain united, prosperous, and above all, free from the disaster that Commodus brought in our history later. But of course, even if Lucius Verus was almost a decade younger than Marcus Aurelius, he too wouldn't live forever. Eventually, the time would come to think about succession once again. And here, in this alternate timeline, another man would enter the stage, a man who in our timeline remained in the shadows, but who now could rise to become emperor. I'm of course talking about Maximus Decimus, Claudius Pompeianus, of course. Pompeianus was not a man of noble senatorial blood, but of equestrian origin from Antioch in Syria. He rose to prominence thanks to his military service, especially during the Marcomannic Wars, where he proved himself a loyal, disciplined, and competent general. Marcus Aurelius valued him so much that he gave him his daughter Lucilla in marriage, making him part of the imperial family itself. In our timeline, Pompeianus never accepted to become emperor, even when Commodus disgraced it, preferring to retire quietly. But in this alternate reality, things would be very different. With Commodus sidelined and Verus ruling into the late 190s, Pompeianus would continue to serve faithfully as the empire's most trusted general, helping to consolidate Marcomannia and Sarmatia, and pushing Rome's influence deeper into Germania. Over time, as Verus grew older, he would try, again and again, to convince his brother-in-law to take on the mantle of emperor, to secure the stability of the dynasty and the glory of Rome. And eventually, after years of hesitation, Pompeianus would finally accept. By then, he would already be an old man, but that would not matter. Like Nerva a century before, he would be a reluctant emperor, chosen not for ambition but for trust, for loyalty, and mostly for competence. His marriage to Lucilla would tie him directly to the Antonine line, and with their children, he would be able to establish a new dynasty born from both merit and blood. So, with Claudius Pompeianus finally accepting the role of emperor, Rome would enter what later historians of this alternate world would probably call the second phase of the Pax Romana. Because think about it. No plague had ever devastated the empire. Its population would be bigger than ever, its agriculture stronger and more stable, its economy more or less stable too, although maybe not forever, and its trade routes flowing without interruption. The army, instead of being reduced and corrupted by desperation, would still be disciplined, proud, and experienced, guarding an empire now even larger, with Marcomannia and Sarmatia fully annexed, and Germania once again open for conquest in the future. Medicine too would remain at its peak, with Galen and his contemporaries still alive, transmitting their knowledge to the next generation, pushing Roman medicine further than it ever went in our reality, with time eventually, of course. And at the head of all of that, an emperor who, like Nerva before him, did not seek power for himself, but accepted it out of duty, loyalty, and responsibility. With Pompeianus, the empire would not collapse into the chaos of Commodus, the year of the 5 emperors, and the crisis of the 3rd century, not in the 3rd century at least. Instead, it would remain stable, prosperous, and united, opening a new century not with decline, but with renewed strength and ambition. And all of this because a single plague never existed. All of this because the soldiers returning from Parthia brought only victory, glory, and not death. And so, instead of Marcus Aurelius's death marking the end of the Pax Romana in this timeline, it would be remembered as the beginning of a second golden age for the Roman Empire. But of course, Claudius Pompeianus would not live forever either, especially being that old. And as a man who had accepted power reluctantly, he would know better than anyone that his greatest duty was not glory for himself, but the choice of a worthy successor. In this alternate timeline, Pompeianus and Lucilla, the daughter of Marcus Aurelius, would have had a son. A young man born from both the blood of the Antonines and the discipline of Pompeianus. Ambitious, yes, but also well-educated, trained from childhood to value loyalty, honor, and discipline. A man who had grown up listening to the stories of his grandfather Marcus Aurelius and watching the example of his father Pompeianus, the reluctant emperor who carried Rome into a new golden age. And so, with the blessing of Pompeianus, the empire would pass into younger hands. An emperor ready not only to preserve what had been achieved, but to go further. To honor the legacy of Marcus, of Verus, and of Pompeianus by pushing Rome towards greatness once again. And his first ambition would be clear. With the Danube provinces secured and Germania wide open before him, the time had finally come to finish what Augustus never could, the conquest of Germania, with that being the mission of this new generation of Romans born in a world in which the Antonine plague never existed. And with that, I think this is a good moment to end this video. Thank you for watching the video until the end. I hope you enjoyed this alternate scenario about the Antonine plague not happening. And if the video reaches 1,000 likes, I will continue this alternate scenario with a part 2, so you know what to do if you want to know what this Roman Empire without the Antonine plague would look like during the 3rd century. Anyway, don't forget to subscribe, like the video, become a member of the channel in order to have early access to new videos, and comment on what you thought of it. Thank you to our newest member of the channel, Francesco Gaipa. Shout out to you, and I deeply appreciate your support of my work and projects to come. And without anything else to say, see you next time.